Hey everybody, welcome. In a previous video, I showed you how to install Apigee X. Specifically, we were provisioning the Apigee X evaluation version and we used the provisioning wizard. Today we're going to be doing something slightly different. Instead, we're going to be provisioning the Apigee X paid version and we're going to be using the CLI steps. I am Miguel Mendoza and hopefully you're going to learn something today. So let's go ahead and get started. First, let's just search on Google for installing Apigee X or provisioning Apigee X. And we're here. First result, we're on the correct page, it looks like. And when you get to this provisioning page, you'll see on the left side of the screen, you have this menu, and it's separated into two sections: paid organizations and evaluation organizations. As I mentioned earlier, we're doing the paid version. This applies if you're already an Apigee customer and you already have a GCP organization with a GCP project created and you have billing already enabled in that project. So you must already be set with all of those requirements ahead of time. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to be choosing command line. Great. So we're just going to be following steps 1 through 9 in here until we have a working Apigee X installation. We're going to be doing the provisioning in a single region, and this is also going to be a single environment that I'm going to be creating. All right, so very first step, it's asking us to log into cloud using the following command. So what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be running all these steps from the cloud shell. So I'm going to go into my Google project and open up the cloud shell, and we'll be doing most of the stuff in there. So let's do that. Oops. There's the wrong page. It's console.cloud.google.com. All right, so once we're here, basically we want to be using the cloud shell. So I'm going to be opening up the cloud shell over here on the right side. And let's continue. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a prerequisite. You have to have already a GCP organization with a GCP project. So I have created this project ahead of time earlier, and it's already allowed listed, for the license. So if you're already a customer, you probably already went through this, process with a sales representative or somebody who took this information from you and basically entitled the project so that you could install Apigee X, the paid version of Apigee X. And how do you know if your project is already being entitled or not? One quick way to check that, at least that I know how to do it, it's basically you go to the wizard, and from the wizard you let's go open that up. So the installation wizard will check that for you basically. So you just put the project ID there and it says, hey, your project, it already has a subscription enabled. So if you see this green check mark, that means you're good to go. We're not going to be using the wizard. We're going to be going through the CLI steps. So I'm just going to go ahead and close this. All right, so we have the cloud shell already open. Let's go back to the instructions. So very first step, gcloud auth login. If you're running this on terminal on your laptop, yeah, you have to do this. But I think because I'm already using the cloud shell, technically I'm already logged in, but let's just do it just in case. Oh, I mistyped that. All right, so we'll go in, complete the login process. Copy the code. Now paste it back in here. And we're logged in. So let's go back to the steps. And we have to do gcloud init. Again, if you're on a terminal on your laptop or your computer, this is necessary, as most of the stuff is not going to be already set. I'm going to do it just to demonstrate it. So the moment that I do init, you can see that it detected my account because I'm already logged in, and it even detected the project that I'm using. So I don't want to create a new configuration. I want to basically keep the same one. So I'm just going to tell it to reinitialize it. Yes, I want to authorize. And I'm going to be performing these operations as myself. So I'm going to pick that. And the project, it's the Miguel Apigee demo project. Oops, I opened something else. Let me make this slightly bigger. There we go. And look like we're done. So I'm logged in. gcloud has been initialized. Nothing else to do in here. Next, let's clear the screen and go back to the installation steps. So it's going to ask me now to set up some environment variables. These are going to be needed as we go through the steps. Sometimes we'll run, for example, curl commands, and the curl commands will need a authorization token. That's why we need this token over here. And these other variables are there because basically we'll have to fill them in different commands. In fact, I can fill some of them in here. So let's do that. So let's copy my project name. Let me close this already. No need for that. Project number, that's automatically detected or extracted using this command. But this is basically whenever you create a project, you're gonna have project ID and project number. So this is this is what's in here. That's a project number. And runtime location. So runtime location, this is the place where the Apigee gateway is going to be installed on. So the Apigee gateway, you can have, when you're using Apigee X, you can have on per region basis, right? So in each GCP region per project, you can have one Apigee runtime gateway. So in here, since I'm going to be installing on a single region, and we're going to have a single gateway basically, and I'm just going to pick the location that we're going to do this installation. So let's just say this is going to be US West 1. Now, analytics region, you cannot just pick any region you want. It's limited to a subset of the supported GCP regions, and it just so happens that US West 1 is also supported. So I'm just going to pick this here. So now let's copy this, and what I'm going to do is just going to create a environment file with this information, and if there's more environment variables later, I'll just keep adding them. So let's go back to the shell. Let's call this Apigee EMB. Let's paste this. All right, here we have, and looks like I accidentally removed the beginning of this, and I'm just going to add export at the beginning of each of this. And let's save that. Now I'm going to source this Apigee EMV, and once it's sourced, those environment variables are active, so I could echo, let's say, one of them, project ID, and you can see it's set up to Miguel Apigee demo, which is basically what I enter here, since I just copy pasted it. All right, so let's keep going. So the next step we have to do is enable API. So what are these APIs that we're enabling? Essentially, this here we're allowing the project to have the necessary APIs to perform, or the necessary permissions to call the APIs that are needed to bring up all the services that are used by Apigee X, and also services that are used in your own project. So let's go through some of them. So here you can see we have Apigee Google APIs.com. That's basically the Apigee APIs, right? So when you have Apigee X installed, there's APIs that are used to manage the system. That's what it is. So we're enabling that. Service networking, this set of APIs will enable communication between your own project and the Apigee tenant project. The tenant project it's almost like a shadow project that gets created behind the scenes, and that's where the Apigee Runtime is actually living. When you provision the Apigee Runtime, it's not really running in your project. Your project only provides kind of like the IAM stuff to manage permissions, and also provides the entry point network components. We'll get into that later. But the actual runtime is not in your project, it's in the Apigee project. And in order for your project to communicate with the Apigee tenant project, we need to use this service networking APIs. Next, you have the Google Compute APIs. These are needed because in your GCP project, you're going to bring up a managed instance group that's going to serve as a network bridge, so that we can have external connectivity using a Google load balancer through that network bridge into the Apigee runtime. And again, we'll get more into that later. Finally, we have Cloud KMS. These are needed because for the Apigee runtime, we're going to have encryption keys that are managed at the level of your GCP project, right? So we have to enable that API. Anyway, so long story short, let's just do it. So here we go. And let's copy paste this over here. Now, one distinction that I would like to make in here is that I'm enabling all these APIs in this single project, Miguel Apigee demo. And that's not always what you would do if you're doing a bigger type of setup where you have let's say a hub and spoke type of architecture, where you have a parent project with a shared VPC and you have resources in that shared VPC. Especially the networking APIs, you're going to have to enable those in the parent project, not in this service project. For this video, I don't have that architecture. I have a single project, which is Miguel Apigee demo, which itself is the hub and the spoke, right? So there's no separation of where some of the APIs have to be enabled here and some over there. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, so the APIs have been enabled. Let's go back to the instructions. Optional, we can check whether they're actually being enabled. I'm going to assume that they have, and we can move on. Now, step number 3, it's asking us to create a service agent. So what is this service agent for? So basically, while we're doing the installation, a lot of the operations are going to be performed by the service agent. Or what I mean by that is that the identity that's going to be used to provision a lot of the stuff is going to be used as service. It's going to be used by this service account, right? It's not going to be our identity, right? So the service account is the one that's going to have access to many of the assets that get created during the provisioning. So we need to create this first, and then we need to give it permission to that service agent. So let's go ahead and do this. Great, so we have the service agent or the service account created, and we should actually be able to see this if we go to IAM. Actually, I'm already in IAM. And if we look at, I think maybe service accounts, there's a way to show all, even the Google service accounts. It's not this one. It should say service. Let's see, where is that? Oh, I cannot find it now. I know there's a way to show the almost like hidden, Google managed service accounts. Let's just click on IAM. Oh, there we go. Here it is. Include Google provided service grants, and you can see it should be this one right here. Service 399. Yep, that's the one. So this is the wait, no, this is the compute one. Where's the Apigee one? I cannot find it. Computer. Maybe I need to refresh this. Or it could be that now roles have been assigned. So because of that, yeah, I think that's the case. Since I don't have anything assigned to this yet, that's why it's not showing. So let's move on with the process, and I think as we give it permissions, it should show up in there. All right, so let's go ahead. Next step. Yeah, so it was created. So next step, configure service networking. So what are we actually doing here? So in this step, we're basically saying, hey, so in my VPC, I want to have a chunk of my IP addresses and reserve those for Apigee to use. Now, how big is this chunk? How much do we need to reserve? That really depends on the requirements of how much traffic you're going to be sending through the through the runtime. Because what's really happening is, like as I mentioned, right? There's two projects. So let me see if I can bring the architecture overview over here. All right, so hopefully let me zoom in a little bit. So what when we're picking up that set of IP addresses, what we're saying is, hey, for within my customer project, I have a VPC, right? And in that VPC, I need to carve out a set of IP addresses that I want to share with the Apigee Runtime project, right? So those those IP addresses will come from your project, from your VPC, and you're gonna share them with the Apigee tenant project through VPC peering. You're gonna say, hey, I'm going to peer with Apigee tenant project, and here's the set of IP addresses that you can use as part of this. So that's basically what this step is doing, right? You're just saying, here's a chunk of IP addresses that you can use. Now, how big is that range? That depends on how much traffic you're sending through the runtime. Because what's happening here is this Apigee runtime, behind the scenes, it's really a Kubernetes cluster that uses basically native type of Kubernetes cluster where the pods themselves have IP addresses that come from the VPC. It's not like an overlay where there's a whole set of sub ranges of IP addresses, right? No, these are IP addresses that come directly from the VPC. So for every pod, there needs to be an IP address, and how many pods do you need depend on how much traffic you're sending. And there's a whole calculation you can do. Maybe you can need to do a video about that separately on how to size the IP range that you give for the runtime. So for now, I'm just gonna pick basically the smallest one, which would be 20/20. So you can pick anything basically between 20 and 16. So actually no, let's see. Yeah, so I'm just gonna pick the smallest one, which is /20. I don't know if this is correct. I think it's actually between 20 and 16. All right, so again, here we're just reserving it. We haven't actually shared it with the tenant project. We're just saying, hey, let's just reserve this chunk of addresses. So I'm just gonna call this Apigee range. And we're going to use size 10 and network name. Now, what network name is? Well, in this case, we're really using the default network. So I haven't created a specific network. For a more realistic scenario, you would create a new VPC, and in that VPC you have a new network. So it's just really the default one. So let me open that up. And not in the correct place. There we go. This is the correct place. So VPC networks. So this is the one we're using on the default network. So let's go back over here. So this is going to be default. Yes, VPC peering, and the project ID is already set up as an environment variable. So I'm just literally just gonna copy this. And we come back in here, run this. And that was fast. Basically, it just created a range. So I think if we come down in here, VPC network peering, one of these tabs, we should see the new range created. I don't see it. Where did it go? Maybe I need to refresh this. Let's refresh this page. Oh, there it is. Yeah, I just needed to refresh the page. All right, so let's open the Cloud Shell again. Wonder why there's no refresh button somewhere in here. It's kind of annoying having to refresh the entire page just to see that. All right, so we have created the range. Now let's go back to the next step. Now, one thing also I want to highlight in here, see how I only specified, the size of the range. So because I only specified the size, it kind of gave me a random range in here of whatever was available, right? I said, hey, I'm gonna give you that /20, in this chunk. If you want to be more specific and actually tell it, what the actual chunk is that you want, you can modify this command and add another parameter called addresses. And that parameter, basically you're giving the left side of the CIDR range. Here you're only giving it the right side and you're letting Google Cloud figure out the left side. If you want to be more specific, you add -- addresses and you give the left side of the CIDR range. All right, so let's keep moving. So it's been created already. Next, we're going to actually do the peering. So we have the range allocated, reserved for Apigee. Now we're going to peer the project that I have in here with the Apigee tenant side of things. And this is basically using the service networking service. So you can see here, service networking, Google APIs.com, and all of this is already correct. We're using the default network, Apigee IP range. It already pre-filled it for me because I entered it in there. So I'm just gonna copy paste this and let's run it. Now this may take around 2 to 3 minutes, so I'm just gonna stay silent for a little bit, and if it takes too long, I'm just gonna speed it up in editing. All right, so looks like this is complete. And we should be able to verify that the peering connection has been made. I think if we look over here under VPC network peering, again, it's not, I need to refresh this page. Maybe if I go back to the top level, it will reload the information. Okay, yes, the default network. VPC peering. Nope. Let's refresh the entire thing. Okay, VPC peering. There we go. So you can see service networking, Google APIs. That's the name of the peering connection. And you can see a little bit behind the curtain here. This is the ID of the tenant project. You don't have access to this. Only Apigee support and engineering have access to this project. But inside that project, that's where the runtime it actually lives. You know, this is this project over here. Right now, we don't have anything in it. We just created a peering connection, and when we did that, the project I think got created at that point. All right, so let's move on. So we paired our own project with the Apigee tenant project, and we gave it a chunk of IP addresses to use, and so far that's where we are. So what's next? Let's create an organization. All right, so before we can create the organization, one of the things we have to do is basically create a keyring and an encryption key. And that keyring and encryption key are going to live in this project, your customer project. And basically this keyring and encryption key are going to be used for encrypting the data or the metadata for your organization, for the control plane. And I think they call it disk encryption key. It's app encryption key. I don't know why that's the name, but there's two of them. One is for the metadata in the control plane, and then there is another key that we also have to create later for encrypting the information that's stored in the actual runtime. All right, so let's do this. So we already have, actually we don't have this environment variable, so I'm just going to add this to my environment variable file that I created earlier. What did I call it? It was Apigee EMB. Space this in here. And there's one more. App key location. Multi-region. Oh no, we're doing a single region. So yeah, so since I'm doing a single region, I'm just keeping it as US West 1. All right, so next we're going to run the actual command to create the keyring. Let me save this and source it. And let's create the keyring. Now, all these names that you're seeing here, my app keyring, you can change this. Just be aware if you change them, you have to keep track as you're following the instructions, whatever this name is referred to later on, to be consistent and use that same name. I'm not going to change them now just to keep things simple. So keyring has already been created. Next, we're going to actually create the key. So you can see here what I was referring, right? So we created a keyring, and then the next step is referring to the keyring that was just created. So let's go ahead and copy that. Now let's create the encryption key. Now we have the encryption key as well. And finally, This is just telling me to list it. You'll see why we need to list it, because we need to copy this, full name to use it later on. So let's just go ahead and list this. Oh, look like there might be an issue in this command. Oh, all right. So yes, I can see what happened. So app key keyring name, it's now an environment variable where it wasn't earlier. So I just need to change this. This is something I guess I'll submit feedback to the Apigee documentation, because it's not consistent with itself in here. In here it assumes that, hey, your keyring is this, but later it uses an environment variable. Actually, since we're here, I can show you how to submit feedback. So basically you just come down all the way to the bottom of the page and you do click send feedback, and you say, hey, on this page, and then you tell what's wrong with the page, and in a few days the documentation is updated. So it's pretty neat. So do make use of that. It's if you notice problems with the documentation, like I did just now. All right, so where were we? Keyring, my app keyring. This is where we were. So I'm just going to, actually, let me just create an environment variable in case this is used later on. So let's go over here. And add one more. What else is there? I think that's it. Let's save this. All right, so let's rerun the command. And you can see here that it's just telling me the full path to the key that was created, the full name, and we're going to need that later in another step. For now, let me just copy it to a text editor, put it here so I can have it handy, and move on. So we have the keyring, the key created, we have the full path, like it's telling me here, all good. Next, we need to grant access to, basically for the keyring and the key, to that service account that we created earlier. So yeah, let's do that. So you can see here, so how the app key name, oh, it's not filling it in. Oh, all right. So I guess we're gonna fill it in here. So app key name, we know what the app key name is. It's called my app key. App key location. Again, this is not consistent. Some place in here asks me to use environment variables, and here to fill it in. I'll submit feedback so to make it easier for when you guys are following this. So app key location, US West 1, keyring, my app keyring, project number. I guess I can just echo this. Project number, it's right here. And project ID, let's just copy it. All right, so what's really happening? We're saying, hey, give this service account permission to access this app key. That's all there is. Now let's run this. And it's done. The service account has that permission. And one thing I want to highlight in here is that if the keyring and and the key it's in a different project, this command might change a little bit, but this is all in same project. So the service account, the keyring, everything is all in one project. So you can just follow the documentation as is. And let's see, hopefully in IIM, I should be able to see this now. Do I have to refresh the page again? Include, again, we click here, include Google provided role grants. And we have, why am I not seeing it? I thought I should be able to see the Apigee one in here. Okay, I'll ignore that for now. Maybe this doesn't actually live in this project. I think this might, no, it does live in here. Anyway, let's keep going. All right, so we have given permission to the service account. We are giving it permission to access the app key, which is within that keyring. And yeah, all this is correct. Now let's move on. Now we need to create the actual organization. We're going to be running a curl command to do that. And let's copy this to a text editor so we can make sure this is all correct. Make it a little bit bigger. All right, so we already have an environment variable for project. This is good. Authorization, we have an environment variable. Project ID, we already have an environment variable. And analytics region, we also have that. The authorized network default, that's correct. That's the one we picked at the beginning. The one thing that's missing here is this database encryption key name, which we copied earlier. It's right here. So let's just put this in. And so you may be asking, hey, so why do you have to put this full canonical path in here? Well, because the key could be in a different project. It's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily have to be in the same project. So that's why you need the full canonical path. And that's also why you need to give that service account access to that keyring. So I think this should be good now. Let's go ahead and run this. All right, so let's go back over here, run this. And looks like it's happy. It took the information we gave it and it says in progress. It will take, I don't know, around 4 to 5 minutes for the org to be created. So how do we know when it's done? Well, I think there's a command that we can run to check the progress. Let's see. Somewhere in here, I think. No, cannot find it. Well, all right. Well, it's not. Thought it was documented. It just says wait for 3 to 4 minutes. Oh, here it is. So you can just keep making calls to the Apigee API. Basically, this is the Apigee API that says, hey, give me the metadata for this organization. And if you don't get any metadata back, that means the organization hasn't been created yet. And if you do get metadata back, then you're good to go. You move on. So let's do that. And look like I did. So the organization is already created. And let's see. Yep, billing type, it's a subscription. State, it's active. So I think we're good to go. We can move on to next step. Another way you can check is just go to the Apigee UI and see if the org is there already. So you go to apigee.google.com and you choose the organization and you can see it's already there. So that's a quick way where you don't have to run curl command to do that. So we have the org created, but there's no runtime. This is just the metadata, right? There's no actual runtime, so we cannot, set up any APIs yet. Yeah, all right. Anyway, so let's move on. Let's create a runtime. Woohoo! We're getting there. Step 6. This is actually a step that takes the longest. After you actually run the command, we're gonna have to wait around 25 minutes so for the runtime to come up. So basically what I'll do, I'll just speed it up in editing so you don't have to wait that whole time in there. All right, so check that the Apigee has finished creating the organization. Yeah, we did that. So we're good there. Create a disk encryption key. So earlier we created a database encryption key, which they call it the app encryption key. Here, and that was for encrypting basically the metadata that's stored in the control plane, right? Now we're going to create an encryption key that's going to be used for encrypting the information that's in the runtime. Right, so the runtime itself is basically a Kubernetes cluster that has pods that have disks or persistent claims in there, and basically those disks need to be encrypted. So this is what this key is for. Anyway, long story short, let's go ahead and run it. And I don't think I have runtime. No, I do have runtime locations. Let me verify that. Yes, US West 1. I said that at the very beginning. So let's create another encryption keyring. All right, so we create a keyring. Next, we're gonna create the key. And again, these names, you can change them to whatever you want. Just make sure you're consistently replacing the names in the proper location. So now we're going to create a disk key within the disk keyring. And there we go. That's already done. We're getting closer. And just like we had to do earlier, where we assigned the permission to the service account to access the key, we have to do the same thing. And we need to get the name as well in here. And look like we had the same problem in here. The documentation kind of gives us a predetermined name, but then it says, oh, you should have created an environment variable. I'll submit documentation defects so that either these are set to use environment variables or they hard code the name in here, because it's kind of annoying. It's not self-consistent. All right, so this keyring name, let's just create an environment variable for this. It's called my disk keyring. Okay, all right, that is saved. Let's source it. Now we can come back in here and can just copy and paste this. And I'm gonna grab this because we're gonna need this, I think, as well for another command later. Let me open a new text editor. All right, so that's what we're having here. And let's move on. Now let's grant access to the service account. So basically we're saying, hey, for this service account, oh, now they have a project number in here as an environment variable, but earlier it was, I had to fill it in here. Again, not consistent. All right, well, that's good. So environment variable, so I could literally just copy paste this, and keyring, it's hard coded. It's getting a little bit annoying. But again, it's still valid, right? Because it's got the it's consistent at least with this naming here, so that's good. Runtime location, everything. So I couldn't literally just copy paste this and run it, and that's what I'm gonna do. Great. So now the service account has access to the key in that keyring. So let's go ahead and move on. And now we're gonna create the actual runtime. So again, this is another curl command. So let's just copy paste this instance name. All right. So we have to fill in a couple of things in here. Let me just copy paste this to a text editor. So instance name, runtime location. Okay, so this is also a bug in the documentation. You see how this is an environment variable in here. This won't actually work because there's single quotes around the whole thing. So we technically have to escape this. Let me do that in here. I think we basically put single quote so that it closes that. And then where else? Actually, not the other way around. We put the double quote inside, and then the single quote, and then this in here. I think there's another example in here where the curl command does it correctly. Yeah, that's the one. I think I should do it. It's basically just saying, this string goes up to here, then concatenate that with runtime location, then concatenate that with the rest of the string, which is up to here. It looks weird, but it will work. Now, instance name, this is not an environment variable. This is something we had to pick. So how do you pick the instance name? Well, remember, instances are region specific, so you should probably give it a name that's tied to the region. So I'm just gonna call this US West 1, since we're creating an instance in US West 1. Now, peering CIDR range. This has to do with that range that we allocated earlier. So earlier, if we go to networking, the default network, and we look at in here, we can see that earlier I reserved and then shared this CIDR block through the peering connection with the Apigee tenant project. So what's going to happen now when I run this or this curl command, it's going to, I'm going to be telling, hey Apigee, you can use from that block that I gave you earlier, please use a block that is this big to provision the runtime instance or the Kubernetes cluster. Now, since I gave it a /20, I cannot give something bigger. I cannot go with a /16, otherwise it won't fit. So I need to also give it a /20. Okay, so technically I will fully consume by telling Apigee, say, hey, use a /20, and also having reserved a /20, this range is going to be basically fully consumed, I think. So I won't be able to, well, actually it doesn't matter because this is just in a region, in that single region. All right, so I think this is ready. So we have the name of the instance, the runtime location. Oh no, key ID, I'm missing that. So now we need to give it the encryption key. And I'm just gonna put it in, oops, let me copy that. Put it in here. And I think that will be all. So we have project ID setup, instance name, the bearer token, runtime location, the disk encryption key, and the size of the range. Let's go for it. Oh, before I actually run it, I want to show you something. So if I come in here to VPC peering, VPC network peering. This is the peering connection that we have set up with the Apigee tenant project. You can see the tenant project ID here. And if I come in here, you can see that there's no routes imported from Apigee. And that I'll tell you why that makes sense, but there's routes exported. And you can see for every single subnet that I have in this VPC, there's a route exported to Apigee. So Apigee will be able to access all the subnets in my VPC. Now, realistically, in a production type of installation, you will not use the default network. You will not have all these subnets, and you will have strict control of what networks Apigee has access to. So this would be more of more control than what it is now. Now here, every single subnet has a route that's exported, and Apigee will be able to access. That's fine for now, but just be aware of that. Now, imported routes. Why there's nothing here in imported routes? Well, that's because we haven't created the runtime instance yet. So Apigee has nothing to share with my project. Once the runtime instance has been created, and then we'll see some routes in here, which means that from this project, we'll be able to reach the Apigee runtime instance. Anyway, let's just go ahead and run it. And like I said, this will take a while, around 20 to 25 minutes. So I'm going to speed it up in editing so you don't have to wait. Let's do it. Now, while that's running, one more thing. I think there's a command we can run to check on the progress. So and it should be documented over here. I'm in the wrong location. This is not create runtime instance. This is it. Okay. Yeah, so we just ran this. Yeah, and the request can take 20 minutes. Actually, I've seen it take longer. It's more like 20 to 30 minutes. Maybe it's faster for paid organizations, but in my experience, it takes between 20 and 30 minutes. Okay, so here we're going to be checking, basically, is this instance created yet? And here, what this is actually is just calling another of those Apigee APIs that check for the metadata in the control plane. And when we see that the instance is in a good state, active state, I think, then we should be good to go. So let's run this just to see what this will return. So we come in here, and it's in creating. I think once it's done, it will say active. So again, we'll wait for 20 to 25 minutes. One more thing I want to show you. So I've been running all these curl commands from the CLI. That's all nice. There's another way you can run these curl commands, which is from the documentation itself, and it's pretty neat, especially if you don't like curl or for whatever reason you want to have the documentation so you can see what options the curl command takes. You can use the Apigee documentation. Let me open a new tab and show you that. So if we come in here, I think at the main page, just go to /docs, APIs and reference. That's what I was looking for. You can see this, overview on the Apigee v1. And then we go to v1 API. And here's the surface area for all those APIs, or management APIs, as some people call it, for Apigee. So, and the curl command that I ran in here, it's one of those APIs. So if I come in here to organization instances, and then we do list, and yeah, I think it's the same. See, Apigee Google API SB1 / organization thing instances. That is same thing. Organizations, product ID instances. So let's run this just to show you. So now, first time you use this page, it's a little bit confusing. You know, like what do you put in this parent thing? You just look at how it's documented in here. So it says parent is organizations / something, right? That / something is the name of your organization, which is the same as your GCP project. All right, so and here they even help you. So they're telling me, hey, whatever you entered in here does not match the regex or regular expression that we're expecting. So that's another hint, so you can know if you're putting it correctly or not. Okay, these are optional: page size, page token. We don't have to enter those. And let me make sure that this is correct. Apigee demo. Yep, that is correct. And let's just run it. Now, behind the scenes, this is going to get a token for me and all that, so I don't have to worry about it. Just click on execute, give it access. And you can see I get a response, and this is basically the same response I got from the curl command. Anyway, let's just wait till this is done, and then we'll get back to this. All right, so it has been over 25 minutes, so hopefully now the creation of the runtime instance should now be complete. So let's go ahead and recheck that, and it looks like my Cloud Shell disconnected, so I'm going to reconnect. And once we reconnect, we'll just basically run the same curl command. Hopefully it should be in the history. Let's source the Apigee environment. Yes, I want to authorize. And yes, so the curl command is in the history and it says active. So we're technically good to go from the point of view of the runtime instance. So just to recap, if we look at the architecture, what happened was that we now have an Apigee runtime created. And together with that Apigee runtime, we also have the Ingress, and the Apigee instance itself will have that Ingress IP. So let's go ahead and check that out. And you can see here this host address, that's the IP address of the Ingress for the Apigee this Apigee instance. And this IP address comes from that range that we reserved at the very beginning, and then we shared it with Apigee using the VPC peering. So that's where this IP address is coming from. It's from that range. And something else that we can check, earlier when we looked at VPC peering, we saw that there were no imported routes. Now there should be some imported routes. So let's go ahead and take a look. And there it is. So we have a few imported routes already. And these are basically subnets that have been created by Apigee on the tenant project, and now they're shared with my project, my consumer project. All right, so I think we're good in this step. Oh, one more thing. So another way to check it, if you don't want to check in the using the curl command, is just to go to the Apigee UI. So if we go to the Apigee UI, apigee.google.com. Oh, not set up, just apigee.google.com. And we look at under admin, we have this instances, and we should see now that there's a new instance that was created, and there it is. The name of the instance is US West 1, and here's the IP address. So all good. Now let's move on to the next step in the documentation. All right, so we have the instance. Now let's create an environment. To create an environment, this step it's asking me to use curl to do it. We could do it. I mean, since we're doing CLI, I'm just going to keep following the documentation as is, but you could use the Apigee UI as well to create an environment. Anyway, let's go ahead and create it using curl. open a new text editor, and let's pick an environment name. So I'm going to call this the test number 1. So I could have test 1, test 2, test 3, and so on. So this is my first test environment. So let's go ahead and run this. Come back here. And it's in progress. This will take, I don't know, maybe a minute or two for the environment to be created. So come back in here, and then we can check the status to see once the environment creation is complete. And looks like it's done. We have test 1 created already. Great, so now let's move on. Actually, we can check the status. So test 1, so we can run this specific curl command and double check that the status is active. Yes, so the test 1 environment is active. All right, next step, what we're going to do is we're going to attach the environment to the runtime instance. So right now we have created the environment, but the environment in the current state, it's kind of like floating. If you were to deploy a proxy to that environment, it wouldn't work because that environment is not associated with any runtime instance. So what this step is going to do is going to say, hey, I have an environment, test 1, and that test 1 environment, I want it to be available in the runtime instance that I created earlier. So that's the next step. All right, so instance name is US West 1. And there's a typo in here. You can see instances. I have already filed a documentation ticket for that, so that should be getting fixed soon. So I'll copy this and let's fix that typo. Instances, and we're going to create basically an attachment where we're attaching test 1 environment. And again, this takes a little bit of time. This one is more about a few minutes, I think. And there's a way to check the status, basically also calling the Apigee APIs to see if the environment has been successfully attached. So it looks like the instructions say to just run the command again, and if you get a 4.9, that means it's already attached. That's interesting. I guess we could always do a get call on this resource to see if the attachment is there. Let's do that. All right, let's copy this and let's run this. Oops, I think I put something wrong in here. typo again. Instances. I forgot to fix that typo in here. Instances. All right, so it looks like the attachment is there now. It's got a name and it says it's created. So I'm going to assume that it's working, and let's move on with the next step. So next step, now that we have the environment attached to the instance, we need to put this environment in a group. Why is this? What is an environment group? Well, the environment group, it's sort of the thing that defines the ingress into the runtime instance. So right now, the only thing we have for the ingress, it's just an IP address, but there's no host name or anything associated with it. So when we create a group, we're basically saying, hey, we have a set of environments that are associated with certain host name. So whenever a call comes into the runtime with this host name, directed to the environments in this group. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to create a group, and that group later we're going to add the test1 environment. So let's create a new document. So I'm going to call the group. It's going to be the test group, and the host name. For now, I'm just going to make up the host name, and you'll see why in a second, because I don't have an actual DNS system to register right now. So I'm just going to use a made up name. So it's going to be test@acme.com. Again, this is made up. It's not an actual thing. We will change it later and make it an actual working environment group. Okay, I'm just gonna put it in here. Great, so we have the environment group created. Let's move on to the next step. Finally, now we're going to add the test1 environment into the test environment group. All right, so it looks like it already auto-populated this values for me. So I'm just gonna copy the command. Actually, before doing that, let's make sure that what is this doing? Wait for operation complete. You can check the status of the new group using blah blah blah. Okay, yeah, that's fine. Let's go ahead and add the test1 environment into the group. Great. So now we have the test1 environment is a part of the test environment group. All right, let's move on. This is just telling me that if I want to update the host name later, I can do a patch call. That's fine. We're not going to do that now. All right. So another way we can check, that all this looks fine. It's also going to the Apigee UI. So if we come into environments and look at environment groups, we should see the new environment. Sorry, the new environment group. And it has the test1 environment in it. So this all looks good. We can move on now to the next step. So we're almost at the end. So next step is configure routing and finally deploy a proxy that we can test. Now, when you're going to configure routing, this is where you have to make a decision, right? Do you want the API proxies to be available to the world, through from the internet, or do you want them only to be internally from your on-premises applications, or maybe only through, from within GCP itself, right? So, and depending on that decision, then you either do this configure routing or do it differently. For example, if I want the proxies to be available to the world, I'm going to follow this part here where I'm going to have external routing accessible, and that's what we're going to do in this tutorial, or in this video. I'm going to follow these steps to enable external access. If you only want internal access, then it's basically nothing. You don't do anything. There's already an IP address that's available into the within the GCP project. You would still want to have some sort of DNS, so you could use Cloud DNS to map it to that Ingress IP address. Again, this is only one single region. If you have more regions, then you probably want to do something else, because you're going to have multiple IP addresses, one for each region. Anyway, so the other case that I talked about, which is the on-prem type of scenario. Well, when you have that case, you would probably set up something like GCP interconnect, where you will have a private route from your on-premises into GCP, and in that case, it would also be an internal type of setup. All right, so let's do the external routing. So we're going to be following these steps right here, steps 8A through F. It looks like a lot of them, but it goes pretty quick. So what is the first thing we need to do? We need to enable private Google access for the subnet. I mean, what subnet? You may ask, right? So, well, because what we're actually doing here is we're going to be in your project right here. We're going to be spinning up a set of instances, right, or set of virtual machines in a managed instance group. Those virtual machines need to live, have access to a subnet, right? They need to live in a subnet in the VPC, right? So what this is saying is that we need to enable private Google access for that subnet, right? It's not anything else. It's the subnet that's dedicated for those bridge virtual machines. Now, since I'm using the default network, there's also the default subnet in there. So I'm just gonna make sure that has private Google access enabled. So if we come in here, we're going to VPC networks. Then within the default VPC, we have subnets in each region, and we were in the US West 1 region. So I'm gonna click on this default subnet, and private Google access is off. So I want to turn that on. So turn it on and save. A lot of Apigee customers, they will have a completely new subnet created for that, in which case you would turn it on when you create the subnet. All right, so let's go back to the instructions. Great, so we have enabled private Google access. Next step, environment variables. Now, these are a set of environment variables that we're going to be using for the next setup steps. So I'm just going to fill it in, and let me try to go one by one and explain what each of them are. So MIG name. MIG here stands for Managed Instance Group. So it's basically this, this picture that you see here, this set of virtual machines. They're in a group that's a managed instance group. And the whole reason is so that they can scale up and scale down based on traffic. And it needs to have a name. So that's what the MIG name is. It's a managed instance group. VPC name, that's the name of the VPC that has been paired with the Apigee, with the Apigee project. So that's the default VPC. Then VPC subnet, that's what I just showed you earlier, right? We turned on private Google access on that default subnet. So that's also correct in here. Region, that's the region where the runtime instance is at. And finally, the Apigee endpoint. So what is this Apigee endpoint? This is the ingress point into the runtime instance. And there's two ways we can get it. We can get it from the Apigee UI, or as it says in here, we can just run this curl command and then we get the IP address from there. So let's run the curl command. And here it is. Remember I told you earlier the host value has the ingress? Yeah, so that's basically it. So I'm gonna copy that and let's just have it handy over here. All right, so now let's copy all of this and put it in the environment file that I had created earlier. All right, now I'm just gonna add export in front of each of the variables. Oops. Okay, actually, let me just remove these comments from, I don't think it will affect, but just in case. Oops. All right. Now let me source the environment file. And we should be good to go. So let's move on to the next step. Create a managed instance group. All right, so that's what we're gonna be doing next. So before we can create the actual group, we had to create a template for that managed instance group. So that's what this very first step is in here. It's saying, hey, here's a template for how big the virtual machines are going to be, how much disk they're going to have, what type of CPU, how much CPU they're going to, how many CPU, virtual CPUs they're going to have, all of that. And that's basically determined by the type of machine and the operating system as well. The most important thing here is this little script right here. GS, GS is basically Google storage, and what this is saying is when the VM boots up, it's going to have a startup script, and this is the startup script. So what is this startup script? Basically, this startup script is nothing more than when the VM boots up, there's a script that runs, and that script is going to add an IP tables rule. And let's go ahead and take a look at it, just so that we can see it's not real, it's not anything fancy. So we use the GS util. So this is a utility that comes with the Google Cloud SDK and basically lets you fetch files, put files and stuff in Google storage. So we're just gonna cat the script. And you can see here, this is the contents of the startup script. And all it's doing is saying, hey, when you first run, when the machine boots up, get from the machine metadata, get the endpoint. That's the IP address. So if we go back over here, you can see that, there's metadata that we're putting in there. And that metadata is the Apigee endpoint, which is the IP address of the ingress. All right, so once you have the endpoint, then it's gonna check depending on what's available, and basically just add a firewall rule or IP tables rule that's just going to forward any traffic that arrives to that VM. It's gonna forward it, if it comes on port 443, it's gonna forward it to that IP address, and that's about it. So there's no magic, nothing. This is just a network bridge. All right, so now that with that out of the way, let's actually create a template. All right, so the template has been created. So we can move on to the next step. All right, so next we're actually going to create the instance group, right? The actual virtual machines. So we're just gonna use this command to spin them up from the template that we created earlier. So let's do that. Now this will take a little bit because the VMs will take a couple of minutes, or 1 or 2 minutes to actually spin up, and we can watch that. And if we go to GCE Compute Engine, then we should see the VMs are now coming up. Look like there we go. So it's spinning up 2 VMs because that's the the size that we gave it when we created the instance group. Size 2. Next, let's set up some values for how aggressively the instance group needs to scale up, depending on CPU utilization. Now you can see that these machines are really not bound by CPU utilization. It's more network stack that determines whether or not you have to scale. But the option we have here is CPU utilization. So that's what we're going to be using. All right, so let's run this. All right, so the scaling policy has been set. All right, so what is next? Here is this part. This next command is just going to set a port to be named, and that's just port 443. We're gonna name it HTTPS so that we can later create a load balancer and use that port as a reference. There's nothing interesting there. So let's just go ahead and clear this, run it. And let's move on to the next step. All right, so now comes the more interesting stuff. So the very first thing that we're asked to do here is to reserve an IP address for the load balancer. So this basically what we're going to be doing, we're going to ahead of time say, hey, we're going to spin up a load balancer, and this IP address is going to be the IP address of the load balancer. So we don't create the load balancer yet. We're just reserving the IP address. So let's do that. All right, so the IP address has been reserved, and we should even be able to get the value of it. So let's see, gcloud compute addresses list. Oh, I forgot to pass the region, but here it is anyway. So this is the IP address that has been reserved for the load balancer, and I'm gonna copy this because we're gonna be using it later, and go back and change the host name. You'll see in a second. So we have 2 addresses. This address is the external IP address, and this is the internal IP address. So right now there's no connection between these 2, right? So, oops, do I have an extra dot in there? Nope. So there's no connection between the two. Externally and internal, disconnected. If you try to make a call in here, it's not routed to this yet because we don't have a load balancer yet. So the next step we're going to be doing is we're going to create a load balancer that's going to have this IP address on the front side, and it's going to forward traffic through the MIG, through the managed instance group. It's going to forward traffic to this. So in reality, it's going to be like this: MIG, and then the MIG sends traffic to the IP address of the Apigee Ingress. So that's really what's going to happen. This is Google Cloud Layer 7 load balancer. All right, so let's move on to the next step. And this is just getting the IP address. I already did that. I'm gonna run it just so you can see, but it's just getting the value of the IP address. Yep, same thing. All right, so let's move on to the next step. All right, so before we can spin up the load balancer, actually the order doesn't matter, but for the load balancer to be able to reach into our VPC and reach into those virtual machines in the managed instance group to talk to these machines, we need to allow it through the firewall. So that's what the next step is going to do. It's just going to set a firewall rule saying, hey, allow the Google Cloud load balancer to talk to this VM. So let's run this. All right, so firewall rule has been set. Let's move to the next step. All right, so this part is it may be a little bit different for you. So what you're asked to do here is to upload a certificate and key for a domain name that you own. So remember how earlier I chose the domain name, it was test.acme.com. Right, I made that up. Right, I don't have a certificate and a key for that. So so I cannot really upload anything for that, right? Because I don't have it. But what I can do is I can use a service like nip.io, which basically gives you a set of domain. It's better if I just show you, right? So so there's this website called nip.io, and basically the way it works is you have an IP address or some either IPv4 or IPv6, and they dynamically serve DNS entries for whatever you put before nip.io. So if you do NS lookup on this, it's going to resolve to this address. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be using basically this external IP address of the load balancer, and it's going to be like this nip.io, right? And that's going to be the domain name for my runtime instance, so or basically to reach it from outside. So why am I doing this? Because it's fast, and also I don't have to worry about registering any actual DNS records. They're already dynamically doing this for me. In your case, you probably have a team or somebody in your organization that manages the DNS entries for your organization. So you probably should be asking them to add a DNS entry for you, and they need to point it to the IP address of the load balancer, right? And what they're going to be adding is basically an A record to the to those DNS, to the DNS registry. All right, so this is going to be my domain name, and just to get out of the way, I can come back and to the Apigee UI, and if we go back to this group, I can update this, and I'm going to say, hey, it's not test.acme.com, it's this. So let's go ahead and save it. Now you're gonna see later why, how all of this kind of comes together. All right, so let's go back to the instructions. All right, so we were in this step in here that says upload credentials. We're not going to be uploading credentials. I don't have a certificate. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using a Google managed certificate. So basically, Google managed certificate, it's you tell Google, hey, I have a domain name that I own, and Google will give you a certificate for that. Now, how do you prove that you own it? Well, the way to prove it is by pointing the DNS entry for that domain to the IP address of the Google load balancer. Once Google sees that, hey, you did point it correctly, then Google will go ahead and provision the certificate for you. And obviously, it's a paid service, right? It's not for free. But, it's simple, so I'm just going to be using that. So how do we create one? Well, let's do that. So I forgot how to do it, so I'm just going to Google it up. Google Managed Cert. All right, so there's some instructions in here. Let's use gcloud, and basically that's it, just one command. So here's what I'm going to do. Certificate name, could name it anything. So actually, no, let's name it just to match the instructions. When you upload the certificate based on the instructions, you name it like this, Apigee SSL cert. So I'm going to name it this way just to stay consistent. Description, Miguel demo, and the domain name is just this. And I think that's basically it. Let's go check the documentation, make sure I'm not missing anything. Let's see, is there an example? There's no examples. That's fine. So this is basically the command, so I'm just going to run it. I forgot whether we need, I think we can put a dot at the end to make it canonical. So let's go ahead and run this. And that's basically it. So we now have created a managed certificate where Google will provision it for us, but it's gonna stay stuck in this provisioning state until we prove to Google that we own it. And the way to prove it is to spin up a load balancer and point the DNS entry to the IP address of the load balancer. So that's the next step. All right, so now this next set of steps, it's basically creating the Google Cloud L7 load balancer. And it's not just one single command. So the L7 load balancer, it's made up of multiple parts. You have the front end, you have the back end, and you have a URL map. So there's a few moving parts in there. You can read more on the Google documentation for all the components that make up a load balancer. But here in the Apigee instructions, we're basically giving it to you already. Say, hey, just follow the steps and you're going to have a working load balancer. So let's go ahead and do that. So first step, create a health check. Great, so let's do that. So this health check basically saying for the load balancer to check that the backend, in this case, which the backend of the load balancer is going to be the MIG. So there's going to be an endpoint called health C Ingress. And if it responds with HTTP 200, that means that it's healthy. Right? So the MIG really is not really responding with anything. It's really the Kubernetes cluster in here, which has the Anto service mesh running and all that. That's the one that's going to be responding with 200 to the this HTTP request. So let's go ahead and create the health check. Great. So health check has been created. Now, next step, create a backend. So like I said, the load balancer is made up of multiple components. You have a front end, you have a back end, you have a URL map, and now we're creating basically the backend service for the MIG. So this is what it's saying, backend services, create a backend, and initially the backend doesn't contain anything, but then we're gonna add the MIG, the instance group that we created earlier, to that backend. So let's just create the backend, or the backend service. And looks like this takes a little bit of time, probably about a minute. Great, so the backend service has been created. Now we're going to add the managed instance group to the backend service. And this is that step. So let's go ahead and run this. Great, so the managed instance group has now been added to the backend service. Let's go to the next step. So again, this is another part of the load balancer. There is this thing called a URL map. So the load balancer can be pretty complicated, where you can have custom routing based on path-based routing, or maybe based on host name, and send requests to one backend or the other depending on the host name. Can do a lot of stuff. And in fact, later when you add multiple regions to multiple instances in multiple Apigee regions, you're going to be doing more complex stuff like that in the load balancer. But for now, we only have one region. So what we're saying in here is there's going to be a URL map that's just going to, by default, send all traffic to the only backend we have. So it's the default service is just the only thing we have. So let's go ahead and create that URL map. Great, so that has been created, and we're almost done here. All right, so what is the next step? So we have the backend with the URL map, with the health check, we have all that. So now we're about to finally create the front side of the load balancer. All right, so this is what this step is in here. We're tying the URL map that we created, and they call it an HTTP proxy. It's really the front side of the load balancer. And notice here that we're saying, hey, use this certificate. This is the certificate that we created earlier. This is the Google managed certificate, which up to now is still in provisioning state. It's stuck in there until we complete creating this load balancer configuration. So let's run this next step. So this is basically creating the front end. Great, so the front end for the load balancer is there. And the very last step, we're basically linking the front end of the load balancer with the backend that we created earlier. So let's do that. And you can see finally we're going to give it an IP address. That's the IP address that we pre-allocated. Okay, so let's do it. And just like that, I think we're done in terms of enabling external connectivity to the cluster, or no, sorry, to the instance. Now, the load balancer, it takes a while for to become active, and that's usually around, I don't know, maybe like 10 minutes before the certificate it's provisioned and it's actually active. So it's just a waiting game. Once it's active, then you don't have to worry about it. Then you can make changes and update it. But initially, when you first set it up, it takes a little bit of time to start up. So the instances in the managed instance group, they're all green, so that means they're good. And we can check the status of the load balancer. Basically, we just go to, in the UI to load balancing, and we should see now that there's a new load balancer created because we just did. Oh, it's green already. That was fast. All backends are healthy. But the certificate is still not ready. The certificate, I think, should be showing green, so it's still in a provisioning state. Once the provisioning is complete for the certificate, we should have a fully working load balancer. And notice that the key here is that this host name or this domain for this certificate, if we do ns lookup on it, it maps back to the IP address that's in there, which is also the IP address of the load balancer. It's this same IP address. So that's how Google determines that you own the domain name. In this case, we don't really own it. We're taking advantage of nip.io to make things easier. So yeah, we'll just have to wait a few minutes until the certificate becomes active. So while this is happening, let's go ahead and move to the next step, which is deploying a proxy that we can use for testing. So let's deploy a sample proxy. So there's this hello world sample proxy and GitHub repo. Let's go ahead and download this. It's just a zip file. So we download it. Great. Actually, it doesn't help that I downloaded it on my computer. I need to put it on the Cloud Shell. So I'm just going to copy the URL. And we're coming in here. I think I can use wget to download this. Let's try it. Yep. So it's a zip file. I have it downloaded already. So let's move on. Where's the documentation page? Did I close it? Oh, yeah, I just opened this. I just need to go back. So we were at the very end, provisioning a sample proxy. We downloaded the zip file, and next let's just run the command to deploy it. So what's going to be the proxy base path name? Let's see, action import, path to the file. So the file is going to be the same directory, and the proxy base path. This is going to be hello world, I guess. Let's just copy this. And let me make sure that this is correct. right, so this looks good now. It's in the same directory. Hello world is the name. And let me just copy and let's run it. And looked like it was successful. Hello world proxy, yes, yes. So we can actually come now to the UI and we should see the proxy that has been deployed. Yes, it's right here, hello world proxy. And the base path is HTTP bin. So it looks like this proxy is really just a pass through httpbin.org, which is pretty useful. We can use that for testing. So let's see what's next in the steps. Yep, next step is just to try it out. So we can check to see if the load balancer has completed provisioning. And let's go back over here. I mean, the backend is the backend shows us healthy. That's good. That means that traffic is flowing from through the MIG to the Apigee instance, and the health check is succeeding. Let's check that whether the certificate is certificate is good too. So theoretically, we should be able to just call the proxy we deployed, and it will take you to HTTP bin. So let's try that. So if I go over, copy this, come to here and HTTP bin /JSON, and there's an error. Maybe I put the path incorrectly. Let's double check. HTTP bin. No, this looks correct. I guess the load balancer really is not fully up, or 404. All right, so let's troubleshoot this. We know that the load balancer is showing up at healthy. So one thing we can do to troubleshoot is we can go into one of the MIG virtual machines and try to call directly from within there. So let's do that. So if we come into one of the MIG virtual machines, so let's come back over here. Let's SSH in there. So we're getting a 404. So I think that 404 is actually coming from Apigee. So I think there's maybe something else that I missed. Let me try using a curl instead. So it'll be curl x get and let's make it verbose. So if I run the curl from here, let's see what we get. So yeah, we're getting a 404 from Apigee, so it's really routing. So did I? Oh, yeah, I think I know what happened. I think okay, that's totally my fault. I think I created a proxy, but I didn't actually deploy it. Maybe, did I miss that in the doc? Did the doc say to deploy it? Yes, yes, that was totally my fault. So I created it and didn't actually deploy it. So let's go ahead and do that. There we go. So it is deploying. It takes a little bit of time, for deploying to complete, about 30 seconds. We can also check in the UI. If we refresh here, it will say whether it's deployed or not. It's taking a little bit too long to deploy. Oh, it looks like it's done. Let's refresh this. So let's try that call again. Now, before we try it, let's do a trace. Start a trace. And why not? Let's go back from here. Yay, it is working now. Perfect. So that's a successful call, going through the load balancer, going to the MIG, going to the Apigee runtime, going to the proxy, and finally passing through to http://bing.org and getting a response. And let's send a few calls. Refresh this a few times. And if we come back to Apigee, we can see, the calls take a little bit some time to show up in the trace, but you can now see that, calls going through. And perfect. It is working. So that's basically it. You now have a working Apigee X deployment in a single region. The process to add additional regions is very similar. You would create a new instance in another region and then modify the load balancer to basically split traffic between two regions. One thing that when I was first testing this and I thought that it wasn't working, that I wanted to try was basically for troubleshooting. I wanted to go in and SSH into one of these VMs, basically to rule out whether or not it was an issue with the load balancer. It turned out that was not the issue. The issue was that just didn't have the proxy deployed. So once it was deployed, it was working. But that's something that you would do as part of troubleshooting, right? You would individually rule out parts of the system until you figure out what's broken. And I think I already had the SSH session already open. So from this SSH session, I could have run the same curl command in here, but so if I run it just like this from the terminal, from here, from the VM, it will work now because we know it's already working and it's passing through. But if it's not working, what you do is you add this flag, say resolve, and you tell curl, hey, please map this this domain name on port 443, map it to the internal IP address, to this IP address right here. So basically you would run this from within the network bridge, and you're bypassing the load balancer and just going directly. And something else you have to do as well here, you have to add -K, because the certificate that's going to come back is not going to match this because we're not going through the load balancer. So let's run it, and you can see it's working from within the network bridge. Anyway, so I ended up not having to do that because it was a different issue. Cool. So hopefully this has been useful to you. My plan is in the future I will have follow-up videos for how to add a second region and how to update the load balancer to point to that second region in addition to the one you already have. Thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.